our speaker today. Art Byrd is an instructor at Youngstown State University where he teaches a course called The History of Motion Pictures. Art considers himself a movie enthusiast. He does movie reviews for the Review and the Buckeye Review newspapers, and he was a photojournalist at WFMJ TV for many years. Art has written and directed numerous independent short films which have been shown in Los Angeles and in Cleveland. His short film titled The Ballet Audition has over 2 million views on YouTube. Currently, Art is a member of Executive 408 Toastmasters, a local public speaking club. Today, Art will discuss the history of African Americans in film, and he will be giving us a timeline from the 1900s up to the present. So now it is my pleasure to welcome Art Byrd.
Hello everyone, thanks for coming out. Now the way that I'm going to do this, I have some slides. I'm not going to do clips of movies. Reason being because it would probably take a long time to sort of explain the clips and do that. And then I'm going to end it a little early, and if you have any questions or anything to ask me, I don't sit at home and go through the history books. Like Cheryl said, I'm an enthusiast, and I really love going to the movies and doing that. But like as a pure historian of like what I live for, no, that's not it. But some of the facts that I found during this whole research period, I thought have been pretty good. I hope that I found some things that you haven't known about and that we'll be able to sort of talk about. Now, of course, this is the...
Can I interrupt just for a minute, folks? We're going to put the microphone on
okay.
just in case, so you don't have to struggle to hear it.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. Okay. All right, can you hear me? All right, good. Well, of course, this is the last day of the History of Motion of Black History Month. But the one thing that it was shown before is 1926 is that black cinema has been around for over 100 years. And then when the Negro History Week, which was Carter G. Woodson in 1926, which eventually became Black History Month. So it's been around a long time. And here in 2015, when you're looking at a history, it seems like history, do you sometimes feel that history repeats itself? And in films, I tell my class that history repeats itself because some of the things that happened before now have happened again. And we're finding that out, especially with African American films, that those things that happened before sometimes circle back around. And the big thing that a lot of people that I've seen, some of the filmmakers, directors, and producers, they want to kind of break that circle. But the only thing about it is it's going to be really kind of hard to do that. So I've called this timeline the struggle, repression, and also the redemption and artistic spirit. Because a lot of the films that I'm going to talk about today have that artistic spirit. Even though some of the films, if you're going to the 70s and everything, took a slight veer, and some of those films that people didn't think were a proper representation of African American or the African American experience. Well, there was one person that we had thought, Oscar Michel, was the first black filmmaker, and found out that that was not true. There was a gentleman named William D. Foster, and he was a sports writer in Chicago, and he was the one who started a company called the Foster Photo Play Company. I like that name, Photo Play, because there was really no big thing of film companies, so they kind of took that and made it a little bit different. Now, he was not a complete stranger as being a sports writer to being, he was actually a press agent for Burt Williams and George Walker. Now, Williams would have impact on films because in 1916, he would become the first black actor to not only produce, write, and direct and star in 2 films for Biograph Studios. Now, when I say Biograph Studios, at the time there were so many studios that were going on. And Biograph, there was other ones. Edison had one. There was Siglet. There was a whole bunch of studios. So for one man to get his own, be able to do films for them, that was really a big deal. And Byrd, not only was he was a vaudevillian, so he did a lot of dancing and singing, and so he got some of his own films. And the thing about it is, what would you believe is the place? Now, we always hear about Los Angeles. New Jersey actually was one of the places that film started with Edison, because he had his studio, the Black Maria, in New Jersey. And then after a while, the movies migrated to Los Angeles. What would you believe would be the city that actually is the birthplace of African American cinema? Kind of windy. Chicago. Now, when I read about that, I was kind of surprised by that. But it seems like there was so much going on that they were networking and having all these people work on different films. And one of the theaters that they had, and I didn't know this at the time, but they had a lot of theaters that were catering to an African American audience. And they were, one is the Pimpkin, and that was on 27th and State Streets. And it boasted one of the most elaborate movie palaces in the country. Now, do you guys understand what palace is? Now, when you go to the movies now, you've got these cineplexes. How many of you have been to Powers Auditorium inside? All right, that is one of the movie palaces. You look in there, it has Art Deco. It's got all these beautiful things in there. Those were considered the palace. In Warren, they had one, the Robinson. If you remember that, that was a palace. And so they had all these ones, but I didn't really know that they had films specifically for an African American audience. Now, in 1912, Foster directed a film called The Railroad Porter. Now, you would think that something like this would almost be like a drama, but actually it was a comedy based on like the Keystone Cops, if you've ever seen that. And so before they got into what they call race movies, they started to do movies like this. And what they were trying to do is, at the time there was so much stereotypical thing of blacks in films, and they were trying to do films to show them just a little bit different, and this is one of the things they did. The film that pretty much, I can't say nailed the coffin in stereotypes for blacks was Birth of a Nation. Anybody ever see Birth of a Nation? The whole 3 hours? Very interesting. I tell my class that make sure that you say that the fight scenes were very good. Because it's a very interesting film, but if you ever see clips of it, and I think YouTube probably could have some of those, is that the fight scenes are really good, but there's a lot of racism in there. And so it's also based on the Civil War. So it's not only trying to show what was going on in America, somebody's image, but also trying to give a story about the Civil War. It was very, very kind of interesting. Now, the film was boycotted in 19 states by the NAACP, which is the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People. So they had all that going on, and the movie still made like $10 million. Made for $110,000 and goes in to make $10 million. Now, in response to Birth of a Nation, some gentlemen got together and said, you know, we're going to do a response to that. We're going to make films along that line. So in 1915, George and Noble Johnson founded the first African-American owned studio. Now, see, there's a difference between having a film company and owning a studio. So they called it the Lincoln Motion Picture Company, and it became the first producer of race movies. All right. Now, what race movies were all black cast for an all black audience. Now, does that bring a little segregation there? We don't know, but that was what was happening. And they had some titles. Let me give you some of the titles that they had. I thought were kind of interesting. The Realization of a Negro's Ambition, 1916. Trooper of Troop K. And their most well-known film was The Birth of a Race, 1918. The Johnson brothers featured black soldiers, black families, black heroes, and concepts that were sort of like foreign to like the mainstream movies that they were showing. Now, here is the time now. Have many of you heard of Oscar Michel? Okay. Again, like I said before, everyone thought that he was the primary person who was the first black filmmaker. And of course, Mr. Foster was. But about 1919, Oscar Michel did come on the scene, and he did a movie called The Homesteader, which was based on a novel that he had written. Now, he had some other films, Within Our Gates, and it was considered sort of like an answer to Birth of a Nation. A lot of the filmmakers at this time were trying to show a different image that was shown in Birth of a Nation. So they had all these films that were coming that way. Now, Oscar Micheaux did a couple things. He explored the issues of the day called passing. Now does anybody know what passing is? All right, let me give you the definition. Passing occurs when a person classified as a member of one racial group is accepted by a member of a different racial group. Okay? So they have some movies that were, if there was someone who was light-skinned but they were African American, they would be accepted into the whites. And sometimes the whites didn't know that until someone figured it out. So that was one thing that he had going on, was the passing, lynching, and also religion and criminal behavior. So he was covering all the spectrums of what was going on. And his films also attracted controversy. That's the big thing when you're talking about the history of African American films, is controversy. And we'll talk a little bit about that and how that goes. But some of the black critics criticize his work for his portrayal of blacks, which they sometimes perpetuated the same stereotypes found in mainstream. So what they were saying is the same thing that were happening in other films were happening in Micheaux's films. And what he did was he was having a really uphill battle of getting his films out there. He did like 40 films. And the thing that would happen was, being independently produced, what you're trying to do is, of course, make money so that you can make more films. But he unfortunately ran into bankruptcy in 1928, and he reorganized his company with white investors, and it became the Micheaux Film Company. Now, once this happened, he felt that many people who saw his films afterwards felt the tone of his films were much different than they were before. So again, he was trying to get acceptance and also trying to make a profit, and a lot of that did not work out. Early black filmmakers aimed to show the full humanity of African American films and African Americans themselves, with storylines and themes that counter the prevailing ideology. When you say ideology, is what people have an idea of. And the things that they were trying to do was make something out of nothing. You can see some of the films right here, that the production value, even though this is film in a slide, they had a lot of trouble that they had poor production on their films. So sometimes they were kind of hard to even see and kind of hear. All those things were going on, and they were trying to make something out of nothing. And many of the films, they drew a big audience, but like I said, some of the theaters, they had theaters that were for and black audience, sort of segregated, but a lot of things were happening. And according to an archivist, G.W. Jones, now he did a restoration project in 1980, and he said 1921 was the peak year for African American films, not only for distribution. What that means is getting the film out to different places, exhibition, which means being able to show it in a theater, and all these things put together, advertising. They call that integration. So they had all these things going on, and the system actually lasted until the mid-1950s, and things started to change.